Vlad Dracula, a name known throughout history for being one of the more classic monsters alongside those of Frankenstein, the werewolf, and the mummy, the invisible man, and so many others. But there was a real-life human being similar to Dracula, and his name was Vlad Tepes, otherwise known as Vlad the Impaler. And today I want to talk about him, his childhood, everything he went through in his adulthood to his eventual death. And I want to present all this in the first official episode of Lore. And just before I start, I kind of want to give a special thanks to Abigail Marie. I'm going to put her name somewhere in the screen as a special thank you because she provided a lot of help in terms of providing resources and kind of backstories and context to stuff that might have been missing that I had a hard time finding, and she was able to provide that. So I highly recommend you read some of her stuff and to check out everything that she provides because it is like very good in terms of research that you want to do or if you want to learn more about Vlad the Impaler. So again, special thanks to her and special thanks to you for watching the video. So there's no exact date as to when he was born. It's been said that he was born around 1429 to 1431, but I'm going to be leaning a little more on 31 just because it kind of makes a little more sense timeline wise. But to be honest, you can pick in between those dates, whichever you see fit. So he was born in Sigiswara to Vlad II, who at the time I believe was making coins. I don't know exactly to who, but that's what his current job was. There's not much information about his mother, but he did have 3 siblings, the oldest one being Mircea, and the 2 younger ones being called Radu and Vlad. But just to kind of make it easier and not as confusing, I'm just going to be calling him the monk, and you'll kind of figure out why later on in the timeline. So just so you know, it's just going to be called the monk because it'll be a little confusing just hearing Vlad and Vlad. But yes, there's not much information about the mother, but there is kind of guesses that she might have been related to royalty in Moldavia at the time. But again, there's not really any confirmation about this. And so sadly, he really didn't have a good start to his life because his mother passed away when he was around 5 to 7, which is really sad, especially since back then, culturally, the mother would take care of the kids up till the age of 10. So in terms of bathing, sleeping, stuff like that, would be up to her. But sadly, she wasn't there for that, which, you know, might have really affected Vlad early on in his life. And in the same year, Vlad's father took the Wallachian throne because his half-brother, Alexander, passed away due to illness. So in the same year, he kind of had to move from the very, very beautiful city of Sigiswara over to Targoviste. And just a little bit of information on Targoviste. It was established in 1417 to around 1418. And in terms of defenses and stuff like that, there wasn't much as far as I could find from documents. It said that at the most it had like wooden walls that would eventually be upgraded by Vlad's father and even more so by Vlad as he took power. And it probably wasn't a good move for him to move from Sigiswara over to Targoviste because Sigiswara was very, very beautiful, and I'll probably put some images somewhere on the screen so you can see how beautiful it is. It still maintains its very medieval look, but back then Targoviste was very ghetto, very poor. It wasn't really a good living place unless you were someone wealthy, but yeah, it just wasn't good. Not to mention that the nobles in Targoviste were very Game of Thrones-esque in terms of them plotting against each other or willing to do stuff just to gain political power. So in terms of that, it just wasn't a really healthy living situation for Vlad as a child who, you know, lost his mother. Not to mention that he wasn't really close with much of his family. He was only really close to his mother and his older brother Mircea. He wasn't close to his father because his father was busy ruling Wallachia, and he didn't meet his brothers until later on. And even then, with having a bond with Mircea, it wasn't really as close as it could have been because there was an age gap. I believe that there was like a 1 to 3 year age difference between the two. But again, it wasn't as horrible because Mircea still played and talked with Vlad. They still spent time together, stuff like that. Not to mention that they had the same teacher. So in terms of spending time together, they did spend a lot of time together. And in the same year, Vlad's father ended up marrying, I believe her name is Princess Nechna. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, in Romanian or Moldavian. I'm not exactly sure where she was located, but hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But yes, and in 2 years later, his brother Radu was born. And even then, he wasn't really close to Radu because of how the cultural thing was with the mother taking care of the child all the time. And I'm guessing that he wasn't really allowed to be close to Radu at all. So that kind of might have affected their relationship at that point. So I want to provide a little bit of context on the Ottomans for a bit, just so you can get a little bit of context as to what was happening, because there was a lot happening with the Ottomans during this time. The Sultan during this time, Murad II, wanted to expand more up north, so he went to war with Venice, Serbia, Hungary, and the Emirates of Karaman, with him defeating the Emirates of Karaman in 1428, and Venice withdrawing in 1432. And so in the 1430s, Murad was basically claiming a lot of territory in the Balkans, even annexing Serbia in 39. And it wasn't until 1441 where the Holy Roman Empire and Poland started to join in the war, which would also kind of bring in a very pivotal character during all this, who was more known back then as Janos Hunyadi, but just to make it a little easier on myself, I'm just going to be referring him to John Hunyadi. So there you go. So this was a very turbulent time to be in, because the Holy Roman Emperor during this time, Sigismund of Luxembourg, passed away in 37 due to illness. So this kind of left Hungary in a very weakened state. And so Vlad, having very little options, basically decided to go with the Ottomans because he thought it was the best course of action for him and his country. So he went over to talk with Murad, and he agreed in the conditions of paying annual tributes and for providing military support, which is what happened in the summer of 38, where the Ottomans invaded Transylvania. And even then, Vlad wasn't really 100% for the Ottomans. He still kind of wanted to play the middleman during all this. He didn't really want to pick a side, because if he knew that if he picked one or the other, then the other would basically go after him, and he didn't really want that. And so in 1441, Hunyadi, who was the voivode of Transylvania, went over to Wallachia in order to talk to Vlad in order to convince him to join his side, to which Vlad agreed. After Hunyadi defeated the Ottomans in March of 42, the governor of Bulgaria accused Vlad of treason, to which caused Murad to basically call Vlad to court in order to prove his loyalty. And so he left Mircea in charge of the Wallachian throne, and basically took Vlad and Radu with him to Erdine, where they were then captured and eventually sent to Gallipoli. And in August of 42, Murad basically sent the governor of Romalia to annex Wallachia, as during this time, Hunyadi basically kicked out Mircea into hiding and basically put Basarab II, who was Vlad's cousin, into power. And they were successful in able to push back Basarab. But this kind of left a situation for the Sultan in order to put someone into the throne. So he went back to Vlad and basically told him that he could have the throne back under certain conditions. And the conditions were that he would have to pay annual tributes. He would have to give young boys to serve as janissaries, which was kind of like a certain type of infantry force back for the Ottoman Empire. Not to mention that he would have to leave his two children, Vlad and Radu, as captives in the Ottoman Empire. And he ended up agreeing to those terms and basically took back the Wallachian throne. And so Vlad, who was around the age of 12 to around 14, 15, and Radu, who was about 5, were then captives under the Ottoman rule. And although they were prisoners under the Ottoman rule, they were still treated as princes in the form of education. So they were still educated in science, art, philosophy, stuff like that. Not to mention that Vlad would be a very accomplished horseback rider. Not to mention he would study the Ottomans' military tactics and would even learn how to speak Turkish. But it wasn't as good as you would hope, because Vlad would be physically abused in the form of whipping. He would also be thrown in jail for throwing fits or tantrums. Tantrums. There was also claims that Vlad was also essayed alongside Radu, with Radu especially being known for having an intimate relationship with Murad's son Mehmed. So this is a very contentious area that I've seen a lot of kind of debate about, because there's a lot of people that claim that Radu and Mehmed didn't really have a relationship, that it wasn't true, that there was that it's a lie, stuff like that. That I'm guessing because he believed in Islam, stuff like that, that it just wasn't really true. But I will be providing evidence as to why I think it does support the fact that he might have been bisexual and that he may have had partners of both genders. And I'm going to be reading, I believe they're called Chronicles, from Lenikos, who was someone from Murad's court, who was a historian, who basically kept an archive of his relationship with Radu. And I will be reading a full poem that Mehmed wrote about a German man by the name of Jesus. So what I'm about to read to you is basically writings from Lenikos, who served in Mehmed's court. He was in love with the boy and invited him for conversation, and then, as a sign of his respect, he invited him for drinks to his bedchambers. While Radu was in his room, Mehmed allegedly attempted to a brother. Radu fought him off, taken aback at the advances. When Mehmed forcibly gave the homie a smooch, Radu grabbed a knife, stabbed the Sultan in the leg, and ran off. Despite this auspicious start, however, the two men allegedly became lovers soon afterwards. And now I'm going to be reading the poem that Mehmed wrote about the man named Jesus. A sun-faced angel, the moon of the universe, saw I. Those dark hyacinths of his are the lover's sigh. Like the shining moon, that coy cypress has dressed in blacks. It turns out he is the king in beauty of the realm of the Franks. Whoever does not set heart on his monkish girdled knots is a heretic among lovers. From the folk of the faith, he is not. To those whom his dimples kill, his lips revitalize. That soul bestower's way is Jesus' religion, I surmise. There, in Galata, I saw him, named Jesus, and Frankish-mannered. Whoever saw Jesus would say, by his lips is he resurrected. Do not fancy that the Bani once submits to you. O Avni, the king of Istanbul you are, and the king of Galata is he. Now, of course, it's totally up to you whether you want to believe if he was bisexual, if they had a relationship or not. But based on this evidence, and from what I could find of same-sex relationship was allowed back then in the Ottoman Empire, not to mention that there was an acceptance of boy love specifically. So it's not hard for me to believe that the Sultan would also kind of take part in this sort of activity. But again, it's totally up to you. I'm going to be providing the sources in the description in a doc, so that way if you want to search for yourself, then it's all up to you. I also forgot to bring up that during the poem there's a little section where it says O Avni. I just kind of want to bring up the fact that this is Mehmed's poem, because this is kind of his writer's name. He had back then, it was Avni, so it just kind of links up with this kind of being accurate information. Just kind of forgot about that, but I want to bring it up. So Vlad, I'm guessing, in order to maintain peace, basically didn't do much in 43 to 44. That was until the Crusade of Varna, with the support of Bulgarian fleets, basically took the fortress of Jurjud in 45. And because of that, I'm pretty sure Vlad knew that he basically threw his kids to the wolves, because in a letter that he wrote, he basically stated that he said, quote, "I left my children to be butchered for Christian peace so that he and his country could be subject to the king of Hungary." There was also letters that mentioned, at least from what I could find, that I'm guessing that Hunyadi started to realize that Vlad wasn't someone that he should trust as much, because he wasn't really picking one side or the other. He started to see that he wasn't as pro-Hungary as he thought, and that he was basically just doing it for the benefit of his country, not for the benefit of, their cause or for the Ottomans' cause. So it kind of added tensions to that. Not to mention that during the same time, there was a contention for the throne of Moldavia, where Vlad was supporting Roman II, while Hunyadi was supporting Peter II. So it kind of just added more fuel to the fire. So in 1446 to around 1447 was about the time where Vlad started to negotiate back with the Ottomans, basically telling them that he would give them annual tributes and that he would return Bulgarian refugees in order to remain on their good side. And in July of 47, Hunyadi basically told the burghers, the burghers, the noble people, that he would basically ask them to give shelter to Vladislav, who was Vlad II's cousin and was the brother of Basarab II, which wasn't really good for Vlad. And sometime in November was when Vladislav invaded Wallachia in the attempts to kill Vlad. And Vlad was lucky in escaping from Vladislav, but Vlad's older brother Mircea wasn't as lucky, as he was captured by the German Saxons, and they ended up getting some hot pokers, stabbing him into his eyes, and then burying him alive, which was a really, really horrible way to go out. It just must have really, really sucked. And so Vlad was able to escape and head south to the border and almost reached Ottoman territory, but was caught and eventually executed in November of 47. So Vlad didn't really know about the death of his father and brother, because news took a while to travel around, so he didn't really know until October of 48. And at least from the Sultan's perspective, it probably saw as like a gain, because he basically raised two princes from basically them being kids to now become vassals for him. So at least for him, he kind of saw it as a plus. So he basically sent Vlad with a small army to Targoviste, where he arrived in October. And as it was told, he went up to the locals and asked them where his brother was buried. And once he found where he was buried, he began to dig. And once he dug and opened up the coffin, he saw his brother face down with the pokers in his eyes and scratch marks around the coffin. And it was said that, I guess, he was just destroyed at the sight of his brother, and knowing that his brother was buried alive and dying in such a horrible way, cried out in anger, as he wasn't really able to do anything to help his brother. And it is kind of sad knowing all this, because at least from going off a little off topic, it kind of reminds me of like Gohan and Trunks, of how Trunks wasn't there to help Gohan in any way, so it just kind of ruined him. Just kind of like a little bit of a comparison. But it must have really sucked for Vlad at this time, because you gotta remember that he not only didn't have a relationship with his father or his brothers, he only had a relationship with the mother and his older brother. His mother was dead when he was young. His brother was dead, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. Not to mention that he was essayed, he was abused physically during his imprisonment, and he was just treated super, super horribly just throughout his life. And it's really hard not to see, like, at this point, maybe would have been his breaking point, because he basically lost everything. He lost his brother, his mother, everything. So it's like at this point he just had nothing to lose. I also kind of want to mention that he was also witness to kind of a lot of weird stuff in the Ottoman Empire, aside from how he was treated in the form of butchery. So the examples would be of the cutting of tongues or of the chorizos of the enemies that the Ottomans would basically claim. So I'm guessing this is where he might have gotten his inspiration or ideas of impalement and stuff like that later on in his life, was from the Ottomans. So during the time that Vlad was making his way over Targoviste, there was a war brewing on the west side between the Hungarians and the Ottomans, with Hunyadi thinking it was the best time to attack because he wanted to make up for the loss at Varna that happened 4 years ago, and that his strategy was basically to build up support from the Germans, the Albanians, the Wallachians, and the Bulgarians. And he also kind of got hints that there was going to be revolt in the Balkans, which would kind of take a toll on the main force. And then after that would happen, he would basically send in his forces to basically deal with the rest of the soldiers all in one battle, basically doing like a mass victory. But there were some complications, because while he was gathering his support with a lot of the armies, the Serbian king Durag Brakovic basically stopped the Albanians from crossing his territory, basically told them and Hunyadi that it wasn't the best time to attack because he still thought that the Ottomans were very strong still in terms of their military power, and thought it was best to wait. Just a quick side note, he also kind of had like a small treaty with the Ottomans during this time, so it might have influenced his decision, but there's no real way to know. So I'm guessing that once he told them that they were too strong and that it was best to wait, the Albanians, in retaliation, basically started to pillage his lands and calling him a traitor to the Christian cause. And on the 17th of October, Hunyadi was surprised because the main Ottoman forces arrived to where he was and he didn't expect it. And so he went to war with the Ottomans, and it only lasted 3 days until he lost severely and had to retreat. So there's not much information on if Vladislav was in Wallachia during the time or if he was with Hunyadi, but I'm going to be leaning towards him being at the Battle of Kosovo with Hunyadi just because it kind of makes more sense and everything. But after the battle, he went back to Wallachia, and Vlad basically ordered for him to be captured or killed right when he entered Wallachia, but it turned out not to be successful. And so even after Vlad was prepared for Vladislav, he still ended up losing even after Vladislav, having his soldiers weakened after the war, still managed to defeat Vlad. So he forced Vlad back to the Ottoman Empire, where he resided in Erdine for a little bit. And in a letter around 17 to 18, there was talks between Hunyadi and Vlad, basically talking about how Vlad should meet up with Hunyadi. But in the letter, it mentioned how Vlad thought it wasn't the best time to meet up with the person he was sending the letter to, because once the Sultan got a whiff of what they were doing, he would kill Vlad and he would kill the person that he was sending the messages to. So he thought that the best course of action was to wait until Hunyadi came back from the war, and after that would happen, they would basically start their negotiation for like a truce or peace. So I'm guessing after the Battle of Kosovo, Vladislav started to see that maybe he didn't have as good of chances sticking with Hunyadi, and he probably thought that he had better chances with the Ottomans after the Battle of Kosovo, so he started to talk with the Ottomans, which may have caused problems for Vlad as he moved to Moldavia, where his uncle was the ruling king at the time. So he moved in to Moldavia in autumn of 49, but had to kind of leave in around October of 51 after Bogdan was surprisingly murdered by his brother Peter Aaron. And in the same year that Bogdan died, Murad also passed away due to illness, which led his son Mehmed to be the new ruler of the Ottoman Empire. And so with Vlad and Stefan, his cousin, having very little choice in staying in Moldavia, they moved from Moldavia to Brasov, Transylvania, where they were basically asking Hunyadi for military support. But Hunyadi kind of had his hands tied because he signed a 3-year truce with the Ottomans, and he kind of didn't want to cause any troubles, with them. So Vlad basically wanted to live in Brasov because that's where the people that Vladislav exiled from Wallachia were residing in. But Hunyadi specifically told the boyars in February of 52 not to give him shelter. I'm guessing as to not let him basically build an army to go against the Ottomans or to go against Vladislav, which would result in him going to war with the Ottomans. So he really wasn't looking for any trouble during this time. So Vlad and Stefan, I'm guessing, had very little choice in staying in Transylvania, so they went back to Moldavia. And there's not much information as to why, but I'm guessing that Stefan's cousin, Alexandriel, was basically partial king at the time, with Peter owning the north side of Moldavia, with Alexandriel owning the southern part, basically half and half. So I'm guessing that they went over to Alexandriel in order to build connections and to build a force, so that way when the time was right, they would basically go back to reclaim their thrones when the time came. After the Battle of Kosovo, Vladislav started to lose favor with Hunyadi, basically losing Amlas and Fagaras in 52, which are part of Sibiu and Brasov County respectively. And as retaliation for that, he started an embargo against Wallachian trade between Brasov and parts of Hunyadi's territory. And in November of 55, Vladislav decided to take Transylvanian possessions and burn Saxon villages and invaded Fagaras' fortress after Hunyadi lifted up the embargo. And obviously Hunyadi wasn't really happy about this, so what he did was he basically reconciled with Vlad, and Vlad ended up going to war with Vladislav. And around 56 from April to July. And it didn't take long for them to confront each other, as in July the 22nd, Vlad was intercepted by Vladislav, with Vladislav basically challenging Vlad to a 1v1, to which he agreed because back then it was all about honor and stuff like that. And there wasn't much about how the battle went down, but it basically ended up with Vlad decapitating Vladislav, and yeah, that's basically all that happened. With Vladislav off the table, this would be the official rule for Vlad the Impaler. And in a letter that he wrote on September the 10th, he told the burghers of Brasov that they were under his protection and that he would basically protect them from the Ottomans in case they ever invaded, but that he would want the same back if they were ever to invade Wallachia. And in the same letter, he mentioned a very famous quote of his, which I'll read to you. "When a man is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to. But when he is weak, a strong one will come and do what he wants to him." So he obviously wasn't playing around with this declaration. He was basically telling that he was the strong leader, and that if anybody wanted to come take the throne, then they were more than welcome to, and that he'd basically just get rid of them. And you're probably imagining, what he did as his first rule as voivode of Wallachia. And if you guess that he started impaling, you would be totally correct, because that's exactly what he did. He started impaling. And you're probably asking how exactly he did it, and it's kind of self-explanatory, where it would go up through the bum and out the mouth, and in some cases from out the shoulder. And I'm guessing there were even times where he would do it from the torso, so it'd be through the torso, which it just seems so horrible. And let me just remind you, this was all happening while they were still alive, so it's just like a horrible way to die. Or maybe pleasurable if you were, into some weird stuff back then, but whatever. So he basically started impaling the boyars that were involved with the murder of his father and brother. And from what I could find, it said that court documents basically reported that only 2 of them ended up surviving out of all the council. So he didn't really specifically target just about anyone. He specifically targeted the boyars who were involved with the murder of his father and brother, basically just to get back at them. And with whatever possessions that he managed to get from them, he would repossess them, basically use them to pay for his army, to rise up locals or peasants to a higher status, which was really smart on his part, because it would kind of add a sense of loyalty on their part. Not to mention that he would also pay the Ottomans. During this time, the Ottomans were planning an invasion to the north in order to expand more territory. And so Hunyadi basically mustered up peasants and crusaders to defend against the Ottomans from the 4th of July to the 22nd in the invasion of Belgrade, where they came out victorious. But it wasn't as good as it was, because on the 11th of September of 56, Hunyadi ended up passing away due to the plague that kind of popped up after the battle. After Hunyadi's death, his eldest son Ladislaus became Captain General of Hungary, who then accused Vlad of treason and siding with the Ottomans, but that wasn't really true. And he basically asked the people in Brasov to support Dan, who was Vladislaus' son. But during the same time in Sibiu, they started to support a priest of the Romans who was apparently a prince's son, who turned out to be Vlad's younger brother, Vlad the monk. And this was a very difficult time for Vlad, because he had to deal with so many problems at the same time. Not to mention that the monk took control of Fagaras during this time. And you'd think that Ladislaus would be a growing problem for Vlad, but that didn't turn out to be the case, as he was then executed by the King of Hungary in March of 57 for apparently going against the king or plotting against the king, which again didn't turn out to be the case. And because of this, it kind of led to a civil war between Hunyadi's wife Elizabeth and her brother Michael Jelagi to go against the King of Hungary. And during this time, Vlad thought it was the best time to help his cousin Stefan reclaim the Moldavian throne in June of 57. And during this battle, it didn't really take long for them to reclaim it, as it only took 2 battles to force Peter Aaron back into Poland in a retreat in around mid-April. During all this, Vlad and his army basically pillaged Brasov and Sibiu, which were primarily in support of the king. So he helped Michael and Elizabeth during this. Not to mention that during his pillaging, he did his regular MO, which was, obviously impaling men, women, and children during all this. So during peace talks with Matthias's uncle Michael and Vlad's representatives, they agreed to expel Dan from Brasov, and in return, Vlad would allow trade with Sibiu merchants. And in a letter written in around December of 57, Vlad referred to Michael as his lord and elder brother. So these two supposedly had a really good relationship. And on the 20th of September in 59, Vlad took back Fagaras and Amlas. So there's a story around this time called the Bloody Easter of 59, where in this story it was said that he invited all the nobles to a feast that were in his council, and once they were all eating and stuff like that, he would basically tell them how many princes have they all gone through, with some of them responding with 30, others with 20, and the youngest mentioning 7. And that he basically said that why would you guys go through so many princes, basically implying that they were going to eventually plot against him. Of course they denied it, but he already made up his mind. And there was claims saying that he killed around 200, when that's not really the case, because court documents back then showed that realistically he probably killed about like 40. So in terms of that story, it's probably a little bit more of an exaggeration, but there is still, obviously some truth to it. Michael allowed a boyar by the name of Michael, who was an official of Vladislav, to reside in Transylvania, along with a few others, but it wasn't long until Vlad had them killed. And it was also said that Vlad requested craftsmen from Brasov to Wallachia, but he didn't really have a good relationship with the Saxons during this period. With even one event where the Saxons confiscated Wallachian steel that they got from Brasov, and in retaliation, Vlad ransacked and tortured merchants. And this led to Dan claiming that Vlad basically had their merchants and their children either impaled or burned alive, counting to about 41 to 300, and that basically he betrayed Matthias and was siding with the Ottomans. So there seems to be a lot of contention in this area, at least in terms of Vlad not allowing open trade and stuff like that, where he would only allow merchants to do trading at the border, or he wouldn't allow merchants into Wallachia to do trade. But that didn't seem to be the case, at least in the beginning, where he did allow it. And so from Abigail's research, she was able to provide evidence to which I'm kind of aligning with, in terms of the Saxon merchants not really paying fair prices nor fair taxes. Not to mention that they really didn't like Vlad's policies. Not to mention Dan was one of the primary people kind of adding on to the hate. Not to mention that he would basically steal money in order to fund his lifestyle, which was one of the main reasons why Vlad took Fagaras and Amlas. And so because of all this stuff happening, not to mention Dan and Dan's son influencing Matthias's opinion of Vlad, this kind of caused Matthias to start to support Dan against Vlad. And in April of 1460, Dan decided to invade Wallachia in order to go to war against Vlad, but it didn't really last long, as Vlad was able to capture Dan and basically made him dig his own grave, which I kind of want to read for you guys because it's just crazy to me. Dan invaded Wallachia trying to take Vlad's throne, but was defeated in the same month near Rukar, where Vlad captured Dan on the 22nd of April, forced him to dig his own grave, ordered that the funeral service be read according to the Christian ritual. He was then beheaded next to his tomb. And for me, like, my first impressions was like, dude, this is hardcore. It's like, imagine your enemy forcing you to dig your own grave and like giving you your own funeral service right in front of you. It's like mind-blowing. It's just like, it's kind of badass in my opinion. You know, it's hardcore. It's like metal as fuck. I don't know, it's just my opinion, but you know, it's like, you gotta give him props for being hardcore. So Vlad obviously wasn't really happy with the people in Brasov, so what he did is he went in and basically destroyed the suburbs, not to mention that he would start impaling anybody that he could find as a form of punishment. And during the peace negotiations, he basically told them to punish any Wallachian refugees because he really wasn't happy with them. And peace was achieved on the 26th of January, where he then referred to them as his brothers and sisters. But then not that long later, around the 24th of August, he went back to Amlas and Fagaras to punish more people who apparently supported dance, because I'm guessing he still wasn't happy about it. So right now we're going to get into my favorite subject. This was like the most fun part that I had in doing my research, because they're kind of, it opens your mind a little bit more to how capable and monstrous Vlad is, but it kind of gives you a form of respect, at least from what I was able to find and stuff like that. It's just so interesting to me. And they always talk about how he's a hero in Romania, and at least from what I've researched, I can definitely see what they mean. Even though he was like very monstrous and like demonic, you can respect the lengths that he went to in like this phase of his life. So around 59 was around the time where Vlad stopped paying tributes to Mehmed and started to give excuses. And there's reason to believe that the reason why he started to do it was because the Sultan started to demand more in terms of payment, where it started to double up to about like 10,000 ducats. But just to make it easier on me, I'm just going to call them doubloons. So he was asking for more doubloons. He was also demanding that the citizens would also start paying doubloons to him. Not to mention that he would also request that he would basically give him around 500 to 1,000 young boys to serve as janissaries. So you could start to see that the demands were getting too much for Vlad, at least in this phase. So just a quick side note, there was a battle near Bosnia where Vlad's friend Michael Jalagi was then captured by one of Mehmed's commanders, known by Ali Bey, to where he was tortured and eventually sawn in half because he wouldn't give up secrets to Mehmed on the weakness of the fortress in Belgrade. So this kind of may have added even more reason as to why Vlad stopped paying tributes to Mehmed, but I'm only guessing. And it wasn't until 61 where Mehmed's secretary Tolson Beg basically started to say that Vlad started to turn on the Ottoman Empire. Once Mehmed started to realize that Vlad was in talks with Matthias, he basically sent a man by the name of Thomas Catabolinos to basically demand that Vlad talk to him in Constantinople, and that he also sent secret instructions over to a man by the name of Hamza, who was a bey, or what I could find the translation to, a statesman of Nicopolis, basically telling him to ambush Vlad once he crossed the Danube River. And so Vlad, who basically got wind of this, basically prepared and waited for Thomas to basically meet him in court. And so this is kind of where, if you look up this like famous story of like the envoy basically arriving, they talk to Vlad, and Vlad's basically demanding that they take off their turbans. They basically respond that they can't because they only do it in front of Allah. And so Vlad basically responds by saying, oh, well, let me bring you closer to your faith. And by then, that's when he puts 3 nails on their head as a sign of, you know, them being closer to God, because he nailed the turbans to their head. But after this event, he went down to where Hamza was, and Hamza ambushed his forces, but then it turns out that it wasn't actually Vlad's main force. It was actually him setting up kind of like a coy force. So he basically ambushed the ambushee, which was kind of ingenious. So once he got rid of Hamza, he basically dressed up as a Turkish soldier and basically went over the Danube River to the fortress of Jurjud, to where he started speaking Turkish to the commander at the gate, basically telling him to open up. And once the guard, basically not knowing any better, opened up the gates, Vlad went inside. And once he was inside, he started pillaging, plundering, and burning everything. Everything there. He basically went all over the Bulgarian region, from Serbia all the way to the Black Sea. And once he did that, he basically returned. Once the Sultan got news of what Vlad did, he basically started stopping the seas that he was currently on, and basically started mustering a force to around, that added up to about 150,000 to 300,000. And it was also stated that the amount that he basically was able to levy was equal or greater to the force that he used to capture Constantinople. And this kind of shows that he meant business, because of, you know, all that was happening, and basically Vlad being like, I got you. You know, he's like, come at me. So he went to the border of the Danube with Radu, basically ready to go to war. But before that, he sent a force into the port city of Bralia, where they were then repelled. So then that's when he began his invasion over the Danube. Also, a quick side note, because I completely forgot to mention this when I was like geeking out over these events. But basically, on the 11th of February of 62, Vlad sent a letter to Matthias basically stating, and I'll read the letter. So he basically stated that he killed more than 23,000 Turks and Bulgarians for the honor of the king and crown, and for the preservation of Christianity and the strengthening of the Catholic faith, and that he was also asking for military assistance. So although Vlad tried his best to repel the Ottoman forces when they were crossing the Danube, he really didn't stand much of a chance because their numbers were just way too great. And so what he did, and this is kind of like the part where like I respect him as a military genius, at least in this aspect, because he would use guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics. But like the things that he would do would be kind of ingenious, at least to me, because I would never have thought of doing it, because it's kind of like messed up, but at the same time you're just like this is effective as a military tactic, and it is effective. But he would basically burn grain storages, he would burn crops, he would kill animals, he would create dams to create marshes, he would poison water, and whatever he could salvage, such as animals or people, he would basically send up north. So it would just be emptiness for the enemy when they make their way over, not to mention that every time they would make camp, he would either constantly attack them or wait until someone would go out to collect wood or water and basically take them out. So it would be extremely difficult for a soldier to deal with that. Not to mention, this was like my favorite part of it. This was the ingenious part of it, is that he would basically get sick people, either who had the plague, who had leprosy or tuberculosis, and basically push them on into the camp of the Ottoman Empire, where they would basically infect as many people as possible, like just dwindling their numbers. It was ingenious to me, because it's like he's like go on, infect them all. I don't know, it's just, to me it's like, it's genius. It's evil, but it's like you gotta respect the man for like knowing how to take down the enemy, like with whatever he had to work with. It's just, props to him. There was even one occasion where the Sultan managed to capture a Wallachian soldier, and he basically offered him money, but he refused. And then he offered to, well, not offered, he threatened to torture him, and yet he still refused. And then it was said that the Sultan was impressed and basically said that if Vlad had more soldiers like him, then he would basically rule the world, which I tend to agree. If Vlad had a bigger country, or at least the size of Hungary, he definitely could have done a lot of damage. Just saying. So they continued to Targoviste, where they were unable to capture the fortress of Bucharest and the island of Snagov, where they then arrived at the southern part of the capital on the 17th of June, where they eventually set up camp. And it was Vlad's whole plan to basically try to take out Mehmed all in one night. So what Nikolaus, the chronicler for Mehmed, basically retold was that he basically would dress up as a Turkish soldier, enter the camp, and basically scout everything out to try to find where the Sultan was basically sleeping. An anonymous chronicler mentioned how Mehmed didn't really allow his soldiers to leave their tents in order not to cause any unrest or panic in case of a surprise attack, which Vlad did use to his advantage. And so Vlad basically planned out that he would do his attack 3 hours before sunset until 4 the next morning. So in the dead of night, he would basically cause confusion for the Ottomans by basically sounding bugles and illuminating the battlefield with lights, causing a lot of confusion. And so he would basically cause a lot of attacks simultaneously. And it wasn't said how much casualties there were in terms of how many men were lost, but it was mentioned how a lot of camels and horses were both killed in this skirmish. So there was another boyar by the name of Galish who would basically do an attack on the opposite side of where Vlad was, basically kind of meeting them in the middle. But it was said that he really didn't commit to the attack, as he was quote unquote not brave enough. So I'm guessing he kind of chickened out and didn't really go forward with the attack. And I'm pretty sure he would have done a lot of more damage if he did join in with Vlad on the attack. But it was said that Vlad almost killed the Sultan, but he aimed for the wrong tent. He accidentally went for the tent of his viziers, Ishak and Mahmud, I believe. Pasha, I believe that's their last name. So he was very close. Not to mention that another chronicler by the name of Nicolo Modrusa was able to get an accounting from a Wallachian veteran who basically told a recounting, which I kind of want to read for you. During the entire night, he sped like lightning in every direction and caused great slaughter, so much so that, had the other commander to whom he had entrusted his remaining forces been equally brave, or had the Turks not fully obeyed the repeated orders from the Sultan not to abandon their garrisons, the Wallachians undoubtedly would have achieved their greatest and most brilliant victory. But the other commander, Galish, did not dare attack the camp from the other side, as had been agreed upon. Vlad carried out an incredible massacre without losing many men in such a major encounter. Though many were wounded, he abandoned the enemy camp before daybreak and returned to the same mountain from which he had come. No one dared pursue him, since he had caused such terror and turmoil. I learned by questioning those who had participated in this battle that the Sultan lost all confidence in the situation. During that night, the Sultan abandoned the camp and fled in a shameful manner, and he would have continued this way had he not been reprimanded by his friends and brought back almost against his will. So it wasn't a complete victory because Janissaries under the command of Ali Bey pursued Vlad and his troops, taking out about 1,000 to 2,000, which was the greatest amount of loss during the whole skirmish, was basically them retreating. But in total, I think it was reported that Vlad lost about 5,000 soldiers while the Ottomans lost about 15,000. So it was still a pretty good victory for Vlad. And even though morale was low, they still kept going with the Sultan kind of persevering on. And so they made their way to the capital gates, to where they saw that it was still open. So once they made their way through, they basically saw a very horrific sight. All they saw was basically a forest of men, women, and children, all impaled. And they basically walked through it for about half an hour, just in like awe and in shock. And once they reached Hamza, who was basically impaled on one of the highest stakes to basically represent his high status, this kind of definitely left them all shocked from this. Which, let me just say this right now, this is like metal as fuck. You're just like, okay, we're done. We had like a massive defeat last night. Like, we can't deal with anymore. And then you guys like go right to the gates. You're just like, okay, the gates open. I wonder why. You walk through and then you just see just a mass amount of bodies, and you're just like, oh my god. You know, it's just crazy to think. But luckily Lanikos, who was Mehmed's chronicler, did manage to catch his reaction, which I kind of want to read to you now. The Sultan's army entered into the area of the impalements, which was 17 states long and 7 states wide. There were large stakes there on which, as it was said, about 20,000 men, women, and children had been spitted. Quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. And he said that a man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of men on the stakes. There were infants too, affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and birds have made their nests in their entrails. Now, can I just preface how crazy that statement is, at least on account of the Sultan? Because at least from my understanding, at least from when I was reading it, it basically translated to me of like him basically saying, you know what? This guy is such a monster. He is diabolical. He is like the devil incarnate, but you know what? He knows how to run this shit. And I respect that. Okay, I respect this man. Another funny way of translating it was with me and my girlfriend basically just translating it to he ate and left no crumbs, which is just super funny to me. But in all seriousness, I think the true meaning as to what he was probably meaning was that he kind of respected a man who was willing to go to such depths in order to basically protect his country, and that he respected someone who was willing to go above and beyond, basically do the most dastardly things in order to protect his country, which was Wallachia, and that he basically had like some sort of respect for him, whether, you know, he thought highly of him or not. And so the Ottomans dug a trench around Targoviste in case of another attack, and then the next day their main forces retreated back to the Ottoman Empire, leaving Radu with a small army in the Baragan Plains. And it was during this time where Stefan of Moldavia was basically taking advantage of the situation between Radu and Vlad, who basically wanted territory in Ackerman and in Chilea. He basically went after the latter and attacked in late June. But he only was able to besiege it for about 8 days, until around 8,000 to 7,000 Wallachian and Hungarian soldiers basically caused Stefan to retreat, and that actually resulted in an injury on his left calf to his left foot, which would be an injury that he wouldn't recover from, which kind of serves him right, because he basically took advantage of Vlad, who basically helped him into power just for a piece of land, you know, when he could have been helping him against the Ottomans. So kind of shitty of him. So he kind of deserves, you know, not being able to walk right and taking an arrow to the knee, basically. So although Vlad was able to beat his brother constantly during their little battles, as the days went by, it started to seem that Radu was gaining more allies as the days went by, which kind of gave problems to Vlad, as he was kind of hoping that Matthias would send in someone to help him in terms of like military support and stuff like that. Not to mention that around mid-August, Albert of Istenmezo started to say that Radu should be the rightful ruler of Wallachia. So even more reason that Vlad was kind of losing his grip on Wallachia. So Vlad, with very little help from any allies, not to mention that people were starting to lean towards Radu, he kind of had very limited choices. So his best course of action was to basically go to Hungary and to ask Matthias for help. But during this kind of phase in time, he would meet with Matthias, but it would result in Matthias basically arresting Vlad and basically imprisoning him for a few years until he was eventually released. So surprisingly, new information has actually kind of popped up recently, thanks to Abigail for providing this information. But it basically revealed more context as to what might have happened between these two. So just to give a little bit of context, you're probably asking, you know, why he threw him in jail. So we're going to start off at the very beginning with Vlad sending a letter to Matthias, which he wasn't the only one to receive a letter. It was also the Pope at the time, who also received a letter from Vlad basically asking for assistance against the crusade against the Ottomans. And so the Pope basically, you know, was along for Vlad's crusade, basically was able to amount up to 10,000 doubloons ready to give to Vlad. And so there were some complications with Matthias's plans, and those were that the fact that he still had to figure out some sort of excuse as to why Vlad wasn't able to receive the money, and his big idea was basically to accuse him of a crime. Not to mention that Vlad was basically engaged to Matthias's cousin, so it kind of added layers to the complications. But he already had the plan set in motion, and he basically took his sweet time to arrive with meeting with Vlad. And it didn't really matter because the negotiations were basically pointless at this point. It didn't really matter if Vlad was going to convince him, because he already spent the money, so it didn't really matter. So Vlad wasn't really going to go one way or the other. He needed his men to go fight in Wallachia to reclaim the throne. And obviously Matthias wasn't going to explain to him that he basically gave away all the money for a crown. So he basically told Vlad to basically pack his things and that he would meet up with him, so that way he could give him some either the gold or soldiers to basically fight in the war. And so Vlad and his men went back to Piatra, which is a fortress, which I'm not even going to explain the whole name because it's just too complicated, so I'm just going to put it somewhere on the screen. But it was a fortress high up on a hill, and so his men basically were bringing stuff down, and Vlad was with a man that Matthias sent by the name of Jan Jiskra, who was apparently a highly skilled assassin and a jailer. So when Vlad's men were all the way down the hill, he basically took advantage of the opportunity and basically captured Vlad when he didn't really expect it. And so once captured, he went and took Vlad to Hunedoara, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, where he was then kept in a small jail, and he was eventually moved from the small jail up to the main dungeon. And once the Pope basically heard the news about Vlad's imprisonment, obviously he wasn't very happy about it, so he decided to send one of his papal legates by the name of Nicolo. And once Nicolo arrived, he basically wanted to question both Vlad and Matthias to figure out what was going on. And in response to Nicolo's asking Matthias, he basically ignored the Pope, not to mention that he basically fired all his cardinals, which kind of gave suspicion to the Pope even more about what was going on. And although the Pope sent Niccolo, he was never really able to get a response from Matthias, with there even being stories as to Matthias forging 3 letters, basically saying that Vlad was hoping that the Hungarians would go to war against the Ottomans, but that turned out to be obviously false, as the letters didn't really match up with letters that Vlad wrote in the past. So obviously it didn't make sense, but I guess they kind of accepted that. And so Vlad, after being jailed there, went to Belgrade, where then he eventually moved to Visegrad, where he stayed for about 14 years until he was released. So in the summer of 75, Stefan of Moldavia basically sent a letter to Matthias, basically asking if he could release Vlad from imprisonment, because during this time, the voivode of Wallachia, Basarab the Old, otherwise known as Basarab III, who was Dan's son, was currently siding with the Ottomans, and he kind of needed someone to take over and basically go against the Ottomans with him, because during this time he was going to war with the Ottomans in about January of the same year. So just a little bit of a side note, because you obviously have questions about, oh, what happened to Radu? Well, basically Radu ruled from 62 to 75, but during his rule it was very contended because of not only Stefan, but because of also Basarab. And so at around 75 he ended up dying of illness, where he wasn't able to reclaim the throne, and this kind of, by the process of elimination, basically led to Basarab being the voivode of Wallachia. And Matthias did recognize him as the rightful ruler of Wallachia, but he was still not providing any military support, which kind of sucks. After everything that Matthias did, he wasn't really the best. So Vlad ended up living in Pest. And so there's kind of like a story around this time where soldiers basically broke into Vlad's house, trying to find a thief that was basically hiding in there. And once Vlad saw the soldiers, he basically ordered the commander to be executed because they didn't ask for permission to enter his house, which is kind of extreme. But what are you gonna do? So Vlad ended up moving from Hungary to Transylvania in about 75, and he did at first wanted to live in Sibiu, which he did live there for a short amount of time, even receiving 200 doubloons from the boyars there on the orders of Matthias. So good for him. He did the bare minimum. Not even the bare minimum, I would assume. But he did end up staying there for a little bit before eventually moving back to Hungary, where he lived in Pest. And in about January of 76, the voivode of Transylvania basically told the people in Brasov to basically support Vlad, because during this time Matthias basically ended his truce with Basarab. And not to mention that Basarab during this time was not having a really good relationship with the Transylvanian Saxons, to the point where the Saxons were basically sheltering his enemies. So Matthias sent Vlad along with one of his commanders by the name of Vuk Grigorovic to fight in Bosnia against the Ottomans in around early of 76, where they were able to successfully capture the fortress of Srebrenica along with others in around February to March. And during this time, Vlad kind of went back to his old tactics of impaling not just soldiers but civilians in the conquered territories. So in late August, Vlad, alongside a man by the name of Stef Barathi, were able to basically push back Mehmed's invasion at Tirgonimst. Not to mention that during this time, Vlad was basically allowing commercial privileges to continue in Brasov, while Stef was basically getting the Saxons to join him in the invasion of Wallachia. And on November the 8th, Bathory's forces were able to capture Targoviste, and during this time, while Vlad and Stef were able to solidify their alliance, were also able to capture Bucharest, to which forced Basarab back to the Ottoman Empire. And around the 26th of November, that's when Vlad basically became the voivode of Transylvania again for the third time. So there's no exact date as to when Basarab returned with Ottoman support, but that Vlad did ended up passing at around late December of 76 to early January of 77. Not to mention that in a letter from Stefan of Moldavia, he basically mentioned how Vlad's Moldavian retinues were also massacred during this. So there are a lot of theories as to how Vlad died exactly, with some theories saying that he was killed by a Turkish assassin, another that he was mistaken for the enemy by his own men, but the most likely one being that he was basically ambushed by Basarab's army of 4,000 compared to his army of 2,000. And the story goes was that his body was chopped up, his head was basically sent to Constantinople, where it was then placed on a spike. So no one really knows exactly where he was buried, but the most likely area as to where he might be would be the first church of Comana of Romania. So there seems to be a lot of misconceptions, at least with Vlad being married to multiple women during his lifetime, with one story saying that he was in love with a woman by the name of Katrina, but that just doesn't seem to be true. Thanks to Abigail's research, and I highly recommend you see her post debunking it, she was able to prove that, you know, she probably never existed, and that Vlad did have a relationship with a mistress who, as far as I know, had his firstborn child, but that he never married her because his whole plan was basically to marry into something more of a royal lineage sort of thing. And that the only woman he ever married was Justinius Gelagi. There's also theories that he also married another woman by the name of Gelagi, but you know, that's obviously not true. So there you go. So there's no real place for me to put in more misconceptions about Vlad, so I'm going to be putting him here just because there's nowhere else to put it. But basically, there were stories written in pamphlets basically describing things that Vlad did, like have mothers eat their children, and then he would cut off the booty part and have the husbands eat it. Not to mention that there was also a story of him dipping his bread in blood in front of a bunch of impaled victims, but that doesn't seem to be true, or at least it's probably more of an exaggeration to kind of give more story to how much of a monster he was back then. So just so you know. And another thing that people probably didn't really know was that, at least from what I could find, the author of Count Dracula didn't really get inspiration from Vlad the Impaler. He mentioned that he maybe picked up at least the name, but in terms of him getting inspiration from all the things that he did in his past, there doesn't seem to be much correlation to him getting inspiration from him. So I just kind of want to preface that. And so we arrived at the end of the video. I just want to say I enjoyed doing this project. It was a lot of fun doing the research. Probably what wasn't as fun was remembering the dates, but obviously I was able to do it. I'm very proud of myself for that, at least in terms of that much. But I want to thank you guys for basically watching it through the end. Hopefully you guys got something out of it. And if there are any students out there who were trying to learn a little bit more about Vlad, hopefully you got something out of this too. But again, I want to say a special thanks to Abigail for providing so much research and so much context that I was missing when I was looking around for stuff. I highly recommend her stuff. It'll all be in a doc, so you can go click on her profile or check out her other posts and links and articles, stuff like that. I highly recommend you go look at her stuff yourself, just in case. But anyways, I kind of want to say thanks to you guys for basically watching it to the end. Again, it means a lot for you guys to basically go through and watch the whole video. But anyways, in terms of another project that I have coming up, I will be doing research on the conspiracy behind Operation Fishbowl. So hopefully you have something to look forward to in that. I will be looking for other projects to do, but that's the current one that I'm kind of cooking up at the moment. But without further ado, I hope you guys have a good morning, good afternoon, and a good night. Until next time, I'll be seeing you guys. Yeah.